Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for coming out on this rainy evening. My name is Artemis Kirk, University Librarian at Georgetown, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first of the Georgetown Library Associates programs for the fall semester. You will have noted that this is the bicentennial of the beginning of one of the, we're told, most forgotten wars in American history, the War of 1812. While it may be forgotten, and we think wars never ought to be forgotten, the history of the war and the stories of those who fought in it will never be lost as long as we have archives. Archives, both nationally, internationally, and here at Georgetown, play a key role in preserving and documenting history. Georgetown established our own archives as early as 1816, one of the first American colleges ever to do so. Our archives include everything from detailed records of the university dating back to the 18th century to departmental records from across the university. We have an extensive photographic collection from the 1850s to the present. In fact, a series of these photos depicting Georgetown in the 20th century are currently on display in the Fairchild Gallery on the 5th floor of the Lauringer Library. When you have time, I hope you will come and take a look. Having these records, photographs, and other documents on hand allows us to illuminate Georgetown's past for current and future generations. Access to all of the information that archives store enhances our scholarship and enhances the creation of new knowledge. Plus, all of these things can be very fascinating and interesting to peruse. We hope you will come and visit the University Archives, located within the Special Collections Research Center, also on the 5th floor of Lauringer Library. Tonight, we have the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of collecting, documenting, and researching throughout archives. I want to thank a number of people whose work has made this evening possible. We have many, many collaborators, and I will name them toward the end of this evening. But first, I want to say a great thank you to David Ferriero and to Trevor Plant of the National Archives and Records Administration of the United States government for helping coordinate the evening and sharing their knowledge with us. Also, I want to thank Lynn Conway, University Archivist at Georgetown, for talking about our archives. And finally, to the many people from the Lauringer Library office and other places around the campus, especially Jessica Pierce, Jenny Smith, and everybody else who's involved in tonight's production, thank you for helping us promote the event on campus. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our new university provost, Dr. Robert Groves. Dr. Groves came to us in mid-August from the U.S. Census Bureau, where he served as director since 2009, overseeing a highly successful 2010 census. Before coming to the Census Bureau, Dr. Groves was professor at the University of Michigan and director of its Survey Research Center, and he has served as a research professor at the University of Michigan and University of Maryland's joint program in survey methodology. He is the author or co-author of 7 books and scores of scientific articles. He's an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the International Statistical Institute. He is a fellow of the American Statistical Association and the Midwest Association for Public Opinion Research. Please join me in welcoming to Georgetown, Dr. Robert Groves.
Really great to be here and to see this great crowd. I have a very simple job tonight. I introduce people. And the first person I introduce is Lynn Conway, who is the archivist of Georgetown University since the year 2000. And in that role, some of you in this audience, I suspect, know this already, she serves faculty and students hundreds and hundreds of requests each year for documents that both describe the Georgetown history, but a lot of other documents that we pridefully archive here at Georgetown. And for that, we are grateful to you, Lynn. She's going to tell us a bit about Georgetown at this period of time, based on some of those archive records. Lynn?
Tonight, I'm briefly going to share the story of Georgetown College during the War of 1812. There are two main subplots to this story, one about efforts to overcome low student numbers and uncertain finances, problems not really rooted in any action of the British, and one about threats from the war itself. And I'm going to touch on each of these in turn. At this time, Georgetown College was a young institution of modest size. This image, like the others I'm going to show, is scanned from the holdings of the Special Collections Research Center in Larringer Library. It shows two main buildings, which came to be known not very creatively as the South Building, which is seen on the left. This was raised in 1904, and the North Building, which we know today as Old North. These housed classrooms, rooms for faculty and students, a library, dining hall, and chapel. But though we were small in size, we were grappling with some large issues. One significant problem was the size of the student body. Father Francis Neal had become president in January of 1810. Described as zealous and a gentleman of courtly manner, he was unsuited for the role, and the college declined during his administration. By the end of his 2-year term, there were only 16 students left. There were really two main reasons for this drop in students. Georgetown now had to compete with local rivals to attract students. St. Mary's, a Catholic seminary in Baltimore, had chartered as a civil college in 1805 and immediately began attracting students from Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and the West Indies, all areas from which Georgetown had been drawing students. And in 1808, a Jesuit school, the New York Literary Institution, was founded. Compounding this competition was the severely disciplined approach that Neal took to running a school, an approach that many parents seem to have found off-putting, and which John Carroll, our founder, described as too monastic and rigorous regulations not calculated for the meridian of America. And low student numbers exacerbated a chronic problem with finances. From the start, John Carroll had struggled to fund his school. Construction began on our first building, the South Building, in April 1788, but Carroll wasn't able to raise the £75 needed to pay for the acre on which it was being built until January of the following year. And things didn't improve in the decades that followed. The exterior of Old North was completed by 1795, but paying for that work proved difficult. In fact, records in the university archives even show that at one point, building expenses were paid in beef rather than in cash. And after the exterior was completed, there was no money for the interior. As a result, only one floor was usable until 1809, when a donation of $400 was used to complete the remaining floors. This combination of low enrollment and shaky finances led some, including John Carroll, to question whether Georgetown should or even could continue in operation, with the New York Literary Institution appearing the more viable option for a Jesuit school. So into this uncertain situation stepped Father Giovanni Grassi. Born in Italy, he became our 8th president in October of 1812. He's really something of a forgotten president on campus. There are no buildings named for him, no memorials to him, no tangible reminder, really, of the considerable impact he had on campus, an impact that has led some historians to term him as our second founder. A gifted administrator, he took immediate action. He proposed a significant change in tuition and board rates as soon as he became president and got the Board of Trustees to approve it. This wasn't an increase, however, but it was a decrease from $220 a year to $125. Grassi argued that enrollment was bound to rise if fees were set at a level that allowed students from families of more modest means to attend, and he was immediately proved correct. But Grassi understood that while lowering tuition was a good first step to keeping Georgetown open, it wasn't a solution for long-term viability. For that, he had to enhance the reputation of the college. To this end, he quickly involved himself in local intellectual and social circles. He paid frequent visits to Congress and persuaded several congressmen to enroll their sons. And he revived a former practice of including exhibitions as part of the end-of-year academic exercises, so students could publicly demonstrate what they had learned. Grassi made sure to advertise the benefits of a Georgetown education to a wider audience as well. In May 1814, he published a 2-page promotional brochure. Interestingly, this brochure didn't even mention the curriculum on the first page. That was relegated to the second page. Instead, Grassi opened with something that he felt gave us an advantage over our rivals, and that was our location. So the opening paragraph reads, "The college is an extensive and most convenient edifice. It commands one of the most delightful prospects in the United States, and its situation for health is exceeded by none." Because we were on a hilltop, we were considered to be healthier. It goes on to say, among the many other advantages which it enjoys, its contiguity to the city of Washington, the seat of federal government, is not least considerable, as students have occasionally the opportunity of hearing debates in Congress, it being only a pleasant walk from the college to the Capitol. Just as the internal situation at the college was improving, however, outside events were taking a troubling turn, with British raids all along the Chesapeake. Grassi, realizing that the college's contiguity to the seat of federal government might make it seem an unsafe destination, placed a notice in Washington newspapers in early September 1813 to reassure parents that schools have commenced on the 1st and will continue as usual, the existing state of affairs leaving no apprehension of any public disturbance. With the college on the verge of financial viability for the first time, the last thing Grassi needed was for anxious parents to keep their children and their tuition payments away. And Georgetown was considered safer than other locations in the area. In fact, cattle and tobacco from Jesuit farms in Maryland were moved to campus for safekeeping. By August of 1814, however, it was clear that Grassi's newspaper statement no longer held true. The British were advancing towards Washington, and on August the 24th, they broke through the city's defenses. Faculty and students who'd stayed on campus over the summer break watched events unfold from the top floor of Old North, with Father John McElroy writing in his diary that the glow from the many burning buildings in the city of Washington was so great that it was possible to read by it that night on campus. Many local residents fled, fearing that Georgetown would be the next target of the British. Some left valuables at the college for safekeeping. Grassi made the decision to stay, although he did take the precaution of having all the articles of silver plate hidden. On August the 26th, he learned that the British had left and preparations resumed for the start of the school year. Classes began on September the 1st, 1814, but it was still unclear whether the school year could proceed. The threat now loomed not so much from the British as from the federal government. Old North was one of the largest undamaged structures in the area. In his brochure, Grassi had noted that students had only a pleasant walk to Congress. The concern was now that that walk would become a lot shorter if campus was co-opted to serve as a temporary seat of government. Grassi consulted with John Carroll in Baltimore over this possibility, and Carroll replied in a letter of September the 30th, 1814. He said, "I cannot believe, if the Congress move at all, that it will be to Georgetown, since if the British get reinforced, the government will be so little more safe there than at Washington that they will seek some safer refuge. I hope, therefore, that you will not be reduced to the necessity of deciding on the grant or the refusal of the college. If a decision should be formally called for, the trustees must be determined on to answer. And the present impression on my mind is that it should not be yielded up if it can be withheld without giving general offense to the people of America." Carroll further advised later in the letter that if resisting was impossible, then students should be sent home, as boarding them off campus would mean a destruction of the excellent discipline now established and render impractical the same attention to their moral conduct. The taking over of campus would have been a serious, probably fatal blow to all of Grassi's progress. Had the college closed for any period of time, it likely wouldn't have reopened. And in early October, this prospect loomed larger after the government of Georgetown, and Georgetown had a separate municipal government until 1871, authorized the mayor to offer Georgetown as an interim capital, having ascertained, according to one newspaper account, that the trustees would cheerfully give up the college. In reality, it appears that Grassi and the trustees could simply see no alternative. They were resigned, not cheerful. But fortunately, John Carroll was proved correct and the offer wasn't acted on. And so the college suffered no harm during the war. Afterwards, it entered a period of growth that continued with only a few interruptions until the Civil War. This growth was sparked by Grassi's leadership until 1817, when he was recalled to Italy. It was also helped by the closing of the New York Literary Institution in April 1814, after Georgetown finally began to win the competition for students. John Carroll died on December the 3rd, 1815. By that time, he could have been confident that his school was a thriving and viable enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. That was fascinating. The next person I'd like to introduce is David Ferriero, whom I met in my stint at the Census Bureau. And when Artemis told me that he was speaking, I twisted her arm greatly to see if I could be here tonight. So it's a delight for me to do that. I both admire him and like him. That doesn't always happen together. He, before his current position as the 10th Archivist of the United States, which he assumed in November of 2009, he was the director of the New York Public Library, libraries, I should say, and although that itself is a wonderful position, what he did there was magnificent in terms of integrating a lot of different libraries together. Before that, he was in important and directorial positions at MIT and Duke. I must admit, after I became Census Bureau Director and visited those campuses, the first thing that came to the minds of many was, "Do you know David?" And I said, "Well, I do." And they would say, "Well, he's a Renaissance man. You must know that." And I said, "Well, what I know of David suggests that that is an insult to him. He knows much more than most Renaissance men knew." And I'll tell you a story that illustrates how he guided me. So this might have been the first time we had lunch. One of the few powers that the Census Bureau Director has is to alter the number of years that transpire between the taking of a census and the release of individual records by the archive. This is one of the cooperative acts of the two institutions. And in this country, for years and years and years, it's been 72 years. As we live longer, and in fact, the release of the 1940 census is an example of that, many living people now see their own census records. That was not intended, I think, at the time it was set. And I, as Census Bureau Director, was worried about daughters going to mothers and saying, "Mom, you never told me about this," looking at the census record when they were a small child. So I was mentioning to David, I was thinking about changing that to 99 years, which is a common thing. And he said in his own polite way, "Are you crazy?" And he told me the story of dealing with genealogists at the National Archives. I think the story went that there are microfilm readers, 80% of which weren't being used much each day, kept records, careful records, so he decided to trim down the count. And an outrage of protests came from genealogists from around the country. He said, "You don't want to fool with these people. Don't do that." So I am delighted to introduce my friend, and I can't wait to hear what he says about this important topic, and I'm delighted that he's visiting Georgetown. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Bob, and it's a real pleasure to be introduced by you. And for those of you who haven't met Bob yet, you're going to love having him on your campus. Artemis, you're going to love having him as your boss. He's a library person. Artemis and I also go way back. Artemis was the director of the libraries at Simmons when I was in the libraries at MIT, so we have a history also. So what I'm going to do tonight is to talk to you, cover three things. One, to give you some background on who we are and what we do, since one of the first questions I usually get is, so are you part of the Library of Congress? So I want to set the stage for who we are, give you a high-level overview of the War of 1812, and then tell that same story through the records of the government, your records. And I'm accompanied by Trevor Plant, who's the Chief of Research at Archives One, who has worked with me on putting this together, and he and I will walk you through the records, okay? So first of all, the National Archives, we are the nation's record keeper. We got a late start in that business. It wasn't until the Franklin Roosevelt administration that the archives was created. The doors opened in 1935. So what we're going to show you tonight, you should keep that in mind. It's just absolutely amazing that these records survived. When Robert Connor, who was the first archivist of the United States, he was a history faculty member at Chapel Hill, when he was getting ready to take over his new job, he did a lot of evaluation of the state of the records, where they were and what kind of condition they were in. They were stored in attics and basements, subject to fire and theft and flood and all kinds of horrible circumstances. There's a great story of the garage on the grounds of the White House where presidential records were being stored. A fire in that garage. Rutherford B. Hayes himself in a fire brigade, bucket brigade on the lawn of the White House putting out the fire. So it's amazing that we have what we have from those early days. That collection today measures about 12 billion pages. 12 billion pages. That translates into 1.4 million trees. If you laid those 12 billion pages end to end, they would circle the globe 84 times. It's an amazing collection. And that's just the paper. We have 40 million photographs, miles and miles of film and video. And the largest growing collection, as you might expect, is electronic records. We started collecting electronic mail during the Reagan administration, and the Reagan and George H.W. Bush libraries combined have about 2.5 million electronic mail messages. The Clinton White House has 20 million email messages, and the George W. Bush Library, 210 million email messages. So that gives you some sense of what the future looks like in terms of the records of the country. Those records are in 44 facilities around the country, from Anchorage, Alaska to Atlanta, Georgia. And our main user groups, as you heard, genealogists are right up there at the top, veterans, scholars, the general public. And we're doing a lot to make it easier for people to do their work. So we have digitization partnerships with Ancestry.com. Those of you who have tried to search your own ancestry, if you're using Ancestry.com, chances are you're using records from the National Archives, census records, ships passenger lists, immigration records. We have digitized a lot on our own. We have something called Docs Teach, about 5,000 primary sources with lesson plans that are being used in the K through 12 community. And, on tonight's topic, the War of 1812, a wonderful project that we're doing with Ancestry.com to do the pension files from the War of 1812. So we're very excited about that. So let me give you a quick overview of the war itself. On the 1st of June, 1812, President James Madison sent a message to Congress outlining the nation's grievances with England. The House of Representatives then took 4 days to discuss, debate, and deliberate, and then voted for a declaration of war. The vote in the House was 79 to 39 in favor. The Senate approved the declaration with some amendments by a vote of 19 to 13 in favor. So you can see that the votes in each house were far from unanimous. No Federalist voted in favor. Southern and western states voted in favor, while New England and the middle states, Middle Atlantic, voted against the war. On the 18th of June, 1812, President Madison signed the measure into law, our first declaration of war. On the 18th of June, also, President Madison issued a proclamation of war, calling for support from the American people. So why did we go to the war? Historians generally cite 4 reasons. The first, trade. The British orders in council during the Napoleonic Wars prohibited U.S. trade with France. The second, impressment of American sailors. The British Navy adopted a policy of impressing, taking men by force and without notice from American ships to serve on British ships. Third, problems with Canada. American Indian opposition to the United States expansion in the Northwest was being supported by Canadian arms. And the fourth, the war hawks, anti-British and pro-war members of Congress from the West and the South, Henry Clay of Kentucky, John Calhoun of South Carolina, and Felix Grundy of Tennessee, primarily among them. So let me tell you that same story now through the records of the country. And I'm going to do this by describing what record group they came from, so you get some sense of the range of records that are in the National Archives. We have 585 different record groups that document our history. Okay. So this is yours. Where am I? Slideshow. Okay. So this is Madison. How does that look on the screen? Oh, it's better there than it is here. Good. This is, how did we get there already? There, that's better. This is, when I was talking about impressment, this is a seaman protection certificate. This was what a sailor carried with him to protect himself from that impressment that I talked about. This piece of paper was supposed to guarantee their safety at sea, and it didn't work. But we have a wonderful collection of these documents. This is Madison's message to Congress, and in it he says, Madison's war message to Congress. Let me just quote you a couple of paragraphs from it. June 1st, 1812, British cruisers have been in the continued practice of violating the American flag on the great highway of nations and seizing and carrying off persons sailing under it, not in the exercise of a belligerent right founded on the law of nations against an enemy, but of a municipal prerogative over British subjects. British jurisdiction is thus extended to neutral vessels in a situation where no laws can operate but the laws of nations and the laws of countries to which the vessels belong. In reviewing the conduct of Great Britain towards the United States, our attention is necessarily drawn to the warfare just renewed by the savages on one of our extensive frontiers, a warfare which is known to spare neither age nor sex and to be distinguished by features peculiarly shocking to humanity. It is difficult to account for the activity and combinations which have for some time been developing themselves among tribes in constant intercourse with British traders and garrisons without connecting their hostility with that influence and without recollecting the authenticated examples of such interpositions heretofore furnished by the officers and agents of the government. Whether the United States shall continue passive under these progressive usurpations and these accumulating wrongs, or opposing force to force in defense of our national rights, shall commit a just cause into the hands of the almighty disposer of events, avoiding all connections which might entangle it in the contest or views of other powers, and preserving a constant readiness to conquer in an honorable reestablishment of peace and friendship, is a solemn question which the Constitution wisely confides to the legislative department of the government. In recommending it to their early deliberations, I am happy in the assurance that the decision will be worthy the enlightened and patriotic counsels of a virtuous, a free, and a powerful nation. So although he doesn't tell them what to do, he certainly spells out his attitude toward war. This is the House Declaration of War. And I have neglected, I promised to tell you that I was going to do this by record groups. So the Seamen's Protection Certificate comes from the U.S. Customs Service. This Madisons War Message comes from the records of the U.S. Senate. This is from the records of the House of Representatives. The Declaration. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled that war be and the same is hereby declared to exist between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the dependencies thereof and the United States of America and their territories, and that the President of the United States is hereby authorized to use the whole land and naval force of the United States to carry the same into effect and to issue to private armed vessels of the United States commissions or letters of marque and general reprisal in such form as he shall think proper, and under the seal of the United States against the vessels, goods, and effects of the government of the said United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the subjects thereof. The Senate discussed it and voted and made a minor amendment to it to expand the definition of Great Britain. And this is, once again, records from the House. And this is the actual declaration of war that come from the general records of the U.S. government. And then my favorite, the records dealing with old Ironsides. The USS Constitution, the oldest active naval vessel, which sits in Boston Harbor, was commissioned in 1798. A distinguished career in its history. It was my favorite stopping place as a kid when I grew up in Beverly, Massachusetts, and when we went to Boston, it was the first place that I wanted to visit. So it has a really important place in my heart. This is a pen and ink sketch by Charles Ware in the records of the Bureau of Ships, a facsimile of which hangs in my office at the National Archives. It has recently gone through a wonderful restoration conservation process by our outstanding folks in our preservation lab. So this is what it looked like when I arrived at the National Archives. And this facsimile is still hanging in my office, but this is what it looks like now. So you have some sense of the skill of the staff. The USS Constitution was a star in the War of 1812, and this is a page from the declog of the Constitution. We have in our collection the declogs, which is an extraordinary, in itself, an extraordinary set of records. I discovered that Franklin Roosevelt himself was a huge USS Constitution fan. The FDR Library in Hyde Park has a phenomenal collection of models of the Constitution, and he himself bought two, I don't know how they got away, but two of the ship's logs from the USS Constitution are in the FDR Library. This is a description of the battle of the Constitution with the HMS Guerriere on the 19th of August in 1812. I'm going to read you one section from it. On 19 August, the HMS Guerriere opened fire on the USS Constitution, doing little damage to Captain Isaac Hull's ship. And quoting from the declog, The enemy still maneuvering to rake us, firing alternately his broadsides, we returning fire with as many of our bow guns from the main gun deck as we could bring to bear. The enemy, finding his attempts to rake us fruitless, bore up with the wind. We then set our main top gallant sail and steered down on his beam in order to bring him to close action, hauled down the jib, and lay the main topsail shivering and open on him a heavy fire from all our capital guns. He then ordered a full double-loaded broadside of grape and round shot fired, which took out Guerriere's mizzenmast. Without her mizzenmast dragging in the water, Guerriere's maneuverability decreased and she collided with the Constitution, her bowsprit becoming entangled in the Constitution's mizzen rigging. This left only Guerriere's bow guns capable of effective fire. With the ships locked together, both captains ordered boarding parties into action. The ships soon separated and Guerriere's foremast and mainmast went by the board, leaving her helpless. The British then surrendered. During the short 35-minute battle, many of Guerriere's 18-pound iron cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the Constitution's hull. An American sailor reportedly exclaimed, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron," and Constitution acquired the nickname Old Ironsides. The next morning, after transferring the British prisoners onto the Constitution, Hull ordered the Guerriere burned. This is, from the records of the U.S. House of Representatives, a list of the Navy ships in 1812, 16 ships. And if you look closely on the first one listed, no, the second one listed is the Constitution, 44 guns commissioned in 1798. So we had 16 ships. The British had 585 of them in American waters, and the French, who were also involved in this, had about 100 ships. So that gives you some sense of just how important these battles were and how powerful our own very small Navy was. And now I'm going to turn over to Trevor, who's going to talk about, pick it up at the burning of Washington. The most important prop I brought with me. I told you we had the deck logs of the Constitution. We recently had a visit from some of the crew, the captain and some of the crew of the Constitution, and they presented me with a little token of appreciation, and it is a hunk of the deck of the Constitution. Is this neat? I was absolutely appalled when they handed this to me. It's like, you're cutting up my ship, what's going on? But every so often they have to replace rotting timber and stuff, and this is a piece that, a very special gift.
So the part that he left out is he is himself a Navy veteran. So yesterday he said this is where the split's going to be, so he stopped at the Navy part, and I get the burning of Washington to start. So this is, it's actually a 4-page document, and it's written by 2 clerks to the clerk of the House who actually went out of town to protect his own personal property. So this is their report, kind of an after action of what happened to some of the government buildings. So, and specifically the Capitol, and said, everything belonging to the offices, and this is from the report, everything belonging to the office, together with the Library of Congress, that we're not part of, said, we venture to say, might have been removed in time if carriages could have been procured, but it was altogether impossible to procure them either for hire or by force. So there were people that were trying to protect government buildings that were literally trying to take carts and carriages away from private citizens to take government records out of the city. And so that's the part they're talking about where that wasn't happening. And there were literally fistfights in the city over some of these carts because people were trying to get their belongings removed from the city. So this is the first 2 pages. This is the last 2 pages. Then in the records of the House of Representatives, there's a report from the Superintendent of Public Buildings. And so the one part It's in the middle of the left-hand page. There's 3 amounts that they give. So the first one is for the Capitol building, and it's a little over $457,000 worth of damage. The second one is for the President's house, and that's $329,000. And then other public offices was $93,000, a little over $93,000. So all told, the grand total is $1.2 million. We did it in today's terms, and so that would be roughly $13.5 million if that was today's value. We also have some of the original after-action reports in our holdings. So this is in the records of the Secretary of War. This is from Major George Armistead, who was the commander at Fort McHenry. And this isn't the whole report. This is the first in the last page. So at one point he says, on Tuesday morning about sunrise, the enemy commenced the attack from his 5 bomb vessels at the distance about 2 miles. When finding that his shells reached us, he anchored and kept an incessant and well-directed bombardment. We immediately opened our batteries and kept a brisk fire from our guns and mortars, but unfortunately our shot and shells all fell considerably short of him. This was to me a most distressing circumstance, as it left us exposed to constant and tremendous shower of shells, without the remote possibility of our doing him the slightest injury. It affords me the highest gratification to state that although we were left exposed and thus inactive, not a man shrunk from the conflict. Then towards the end of the report, he says, the bombardment continued on the part of the enemy until 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning. So it started Tuesday morning, went to Wednesday morning. When it ceased in about 9, their ships got underway and stood down the river. During the bombardment, which lasted 25 hours, with 2 slight intermissions, from the best calculations I can make, from 1,500 to 1,800 shells were thrown by the enemy on Fort McHenry. Then this is a map of Baltimore Harbor that was actually done the following year. So you can just make out in the lower right-hand corner, you have Fort McHenry. Then you can just make out just below that is ships that they're showing on the map. And to the right of Fort McHenry, they're showing ships. Those were ships that were actually sunk to protect Baltimore Harbor, the inner harbor, from the British vessels going into the inner harbor. So we also have Andrew Jackson's report on the Battle of New Orleans. So this is January 9th, 1815. And this was a very lopsided battle where the Americans were the clear victors. So at one point in the report, he says, I cannot speak sufficiently in praise of the firmness and deliberation with which my whole line received their approach. More could not have been expected from veterans inured to war. For an hour, the fire of the small arms was incessant and severe as can be imagined. The artillery, too, directed by officers who displayed equal skill and courage, did great execution. Yet the columns of the enemy continued to advance with a firmness which reflects upon them the greatest credit. Further down, he says, at length, however, cut to pieces, they fled in confusion from the field, leaving it covered with their dead and wounded. The totals, there was about 2,000 casualties on the British side and roughly 71 casualties on the American side. So that shows how one-sided the battle actually was. So this is the left hand, that's the first page of the Treaty of Ghent. And then on the middle and the right side, those are actually the last 2 pages of the Treaty of Ghent. I wasn't going to show you the whole thing because that would be like 30 slides because it's a very lengthy treaty. Some people like to point out the dates where the previous one, the previous slide, the Battle of New Orleans took place on January 9th, 1815, where the treaty was actually Christmas Eve on 1814. It wasn't finalized yet. So a lot of people say the war ended. The treaty was signed, but it wasn't officially signed in both countries yet. So these were the peace negotiators that signed it on December 24th. It was ratified by Great Britain on December 31st, and then it was ratified by the President of the United States on February 17th. So February 18th is when the President proclaims that the war was actually over. So that would be a couple months after the battle of, actually the next month, after the Battle of New Orleans. So that's what we had for that, and I think we're doing Q&A now.
Trevor, David, and Lynn have consented to do a Q&A with members of the audience. I see that there is a microphone somewhere there. And if you have a question, it would be great if you would come to the microphone and ask it. I actually have a question. Yes, I can do that. So are we talking about Ghent, Belgium? Yes. Why did it take the Treaty of Ghent to end the War of 1812?
That's where they were meeting. One of the reasons that we called it the First Forgotten War is that most people that do, especially in military history, tend to go from Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II. So a lot of people don't understand some of the things that the archivist went over on the president's message on why we went to war with Great Britain in the War of 1812. And it literally was the treaty solved none of the issues that they went to war with. It basically, the treaty was a very lengthy treaty that basically said status quo. They just went on and said, let's leave everything the way it was. All the territories will stay the same. They went into all of the boundaries between the United States and Great Britain. That was really Canada. So they went at great length to basically explain how nothing has changed. So it really solved nothing. And so, but it was a very lengthy treaty.
Why were they in Ghent, of all places?
They were looking for a neutral place, so they weren't meeting in Great Britain and they weren't going to meet in the United States. So it's kind of like meeting in Switzerland today.
You noted at the beginning that the New Englanders in the Middle Atlantic were against it, and the Westerners and the Southerners voted for it. But most of the action was in New England and the Middle Atlantic states. Was there any political fallout from that situation?
Thanks. I mean, I think it was the same. The people that were for it were still for it, and the people that were against it were still against it. I mean, a lot of reasons that the New Englanders were against it was because of the trade, where this was going to restrict the maritime trade in New England and in the Mid-Atlantic, and that certainly happened. And if you look at the import and the export numbers, just dwindled. So there was a lot of people, a lot of merchants lost a lot of money because of this conflict, and so there were politicians that felt the same way, that they were not happy about the way that it went, and then really that nothing really became of the conflict itself. So we were friends, then we weren't friends, and then we were friends again. Basically, with the Great Britain is how the War of 1812 played out.
Can I ask another one since nobody's here? I noticed in a number of your documents that there are blotches of what happened.
As I was describing earlier about how the records were taken care of or not taken care of, that's a good example of water damage on some. Another problem Connor describes in his analysis of his visits to some of the places where records were stored, where mice, vermin, have been gnawing at the records, so you'll see some with holes in them. All kinds of serious problems, but water damage is really big.
Well, I come from a part of the world where the war actually isn't forgotten, the Great Lakes area, and we were all taught Admiral Perry and all that sort of thing, and since you noticed that it is fairly Washington-centric here, and you didn't start until 1835, so what would you have on Admiral Perry, or how would you go about finding those records, or is there anything? I mean, I know the city of Detroit has a large archive from the battle, but that went to the state of Michigan. So
The example that the archivist used with the deck logs are some of our most heavily used records at the National Archives. They're daily logs that we have for not every Navy vessel, but most U.S. Navy vessels. We have a great collection of Navy records that were actually collected by the Navy Library in the Washington Navy Yard in D.C., and they were transferred to us many decades ago. So we have a lot that you could do on that area. And we have a lot of great stuff on it, but you're right, in that area, it's not forgotten. And they're really the ones that have embraced the anniversary more than anyone else, as we've gotten a lot of letters from the upper Midwest and New York State asking, what's the National Archives doing to commemorate the War of 1812? Because their local communities have been gearing up for this for 5 or 10 years now.
That also include, I guess, many of the armies that were in that area were actually not part of the U.S. Army. They were commissioned. Did you have those records as well?
We have,
They were
that's a great question. The Army records that we have is if it's a local militia that stayed local and wasn't federalized, that would most likely be the state archives. If it was a local militia that was federalized, then we would have those records at the National Archives. And that includes service records. If you have people that were in a local militia that were federalized, we should, in most cases, have an individual service record for that person. And then they would have been eligible, or their next of kin would have been eligible for a pension. So we may have a pension record as well. And that's what Fold 3 is scanning and putting online. So there's 7.2 million pages of those pensions. It's about 180,000, and they're about 3% of the way through right now. So they're chugging away at it, but it's slow going.
As you can tell, Trevor's area of expertise is old military records.
I am one of those herd of genealogists that are so thankful to you for being such great archivists. I have gone back and found that I had about 6 or 8 families in Spartanburg, South Carolina, who all talk about how they walked to New Orleans to fight there and walked home. How would they have known 3 weeks ahead to walk to New Orleans instead of going to, a ship could have come into Charlotte, South Carolina?
There was some activity going on in early December where they could tell that the British were heading towards New Orleans. So it wasn't a big surprise when they actually landed and came ashore. So there were a number of people that kind of walked their way down, including people from Tennessee and other areas that made it to that area in plenty of time to meet and greet them as they landed.
But why didn't the British come into Charlotte, or did they? Charleston. I'm sorry.
There was, early on, they picked that they were going to go to New Orleans, and actually the forces that were involved in the burning of Washington and then in Baltimore were the ones that ended up in New Orleans. So from the get-go, they had already picked New Orleans as a place where they were trying to divide some of the people in that area, and kind of, the Mississippi was a big place to divide the country. And so they were it was a big part of the Civil War as well. So they were taking that as their starting point.
And my husband is a descendant of Susan Wheeler Decatur's, the Wheeler family. And I'd love for you to say something about Stephen Decatur.
It's pretty much what I'd mentioned before. We have records of U.S. Naval officers. Them individually will have their reports, like some of the reports that I showed. We have those for Navy battles. So we originally had one for the Constitution, the Gary era that we took out. So usually, if there's something in a deck log, if it's a big battle, we'll have something that corresponds in reports. We have a number of things on Decatur. Some things written by him, some things written about him. So it's whenever you're talking about famous officers or in either the Army or the Navy, we'll most likely have something on them.
One of the largest collections that I didn't even mention was all of the military records that we had. Anyone who's ever served in the military, we have service records, as well as anyone who ever worked for the federal government. We have civilian personnel records.
Hi, You had said that the U.S. only had 16 ships and the British had over 500. Why didn't the British have an overwhelming victory in the War of 1812?
The French ships that he's mentioned, the French were holding down some of the British vessels in Europe. So that's why they had, and I think the archivist mentioned, a number in the 50s that they could divert to North America. So they, that number is across the globe. And Great Britain was involved in so many different areas that there was only so many that they kind of lent to this effort to move towards North America. Because, they were such a huge naval power that the United States was just, it was like an inconvenience. I mean, there really was no U.S. Navy. So they were not worried about us at all. And this war put the U.S. Navy on the map because they were shocked, and I mean shocked back home at the losses that they took in some of these battles. Like, it was unbelievable to them that their vessels lost to any American vessel because they thought we were so inferior to them and that our Navy was such a joke. So this was, as part of the commemoration, the gentleman mentioned that it's really big in the Great Lakes. This commemoration is very big for the U.S. Navy because the U.S. Navy sees this as a big turning point for them. But this really put them on the map as far as being taken seriously across the globe.
Does the archive have any records from any of the opponents from victories that we had during this war, particularly, like when we beat the Guerrier? Did we take the log from that ship, and do we have that, or was it that you gave it back? Would be given back? Was it burned in the ship, or would it have been given back to the British? And then the follow-up would be, what about not just this war, but in general? How much of our archives, our national archives, do we have that we have from foreign governments and from foreign wars?
That's a great question. We have very little from captured from the British for the War of 1812. We have Confederate records from the Civil War, if you want to consider them another country. We have captured Confederate records. We have, some people still do. We have captured Philippine records from the Philippine War that followed the Spanish-American War. We used to have a very large collection. Now we have it on microfilm. We returned the originals. But we had a very large collection of captured German records. And that was probably the biggest collection we had of captured records, was from World War II. We had a lot of captured German records that probably 10 years ago we returned a lot of that back to Germany, but kept, reproduced it on microfilm before we sent it over to them. So we would have a copy of what was captured.
How accessible is it to the general public to access what you scan online itself, rather than having to actually contact the archives in order to get documents? So some of the stuff is probably maybe classified, but what about the stuff that isn't classified? Like you're getting a copy of the Treaty of Ghent just online. Is that accessible to the general public just going online?
We're trying to put up, because as the archivist mentioned, we have 12 billion documents. We're trying to put up some of our more heavily used records online to make it as easy as you said. If it is something where you want to come in person and see something, all you need is a government-issued photo ID. You don't need to be an American citizen. It's not like some European archives where you need a letter of introduction. You don't need something from a professor saying what you're working on and that you're worthy to do research. Literally, you just need a photo ID. You can walk through the door. If it's something that's on microfilm or digitized, you'll probably be looking at it in that format. If it's something that's not been microfilmed or digitized, then we have pull times throughout the day, Monday through Friday, and you'll be handling the original records in our research room in probably less than 2 hours. And that's one of the things with the deck logs. A lot of the people that are using the deck logs are handling the original deck logs that are one of a kind, the daily log of that vessel, and it kind of, it blows people away that, if you're interested in history, that you could literally be sitting there going through the original deck log.
We have every intention of digitizing as much as we can to make it easy for people to use these materials, and we've we've consulted with our user communities to get some sense from them about what are the most important record groups that we should be focused on. So this is going to be very much a user-driven process of identifying what we should be working on first. And we're exploring all kinds of partnerships with commercial entities to get as much of it digitized as possible, and engaging the community in helping us not only scan but identify some of the records. One of the biggest problems that we have today, especially thinking about the K through 12 community, is that most of everything that you saw tonight, and a high percentage of our records are in cursive, and cursive isn't taught in school today. So kids can't read our documents. So we're experimenting with some software that does automatic transcription, but we also have, if you go to our website, archives.gov, and click on the Citizen Archivist dashboard, you'll find a number of opportunities for people to get involved with the National Archives. And one of them is the transcription process, where we have several thousand records up and are engaging the community and helping us transcribe them. So all kinds of ways of getting involved with the National Archives.
Presumably during the War of 1812, there were some secret dispatches. And I'm wondering whether you encountered these, and whether there was a system of classification and retention of those documents for a certain period of time, and how the archives handle that. And then more generally today, how is the process of dealing with the massive amounts of classified information that's being accumulated, and how is the archives handling that?
For the first part of your question, there was no formal classification system yet. That wasn't until World War I. There was some correspondence that individual officers would sometimes write secret or confidential on the document. Those then later became classifications, but it wasn't an official classification during the War of 1812. Typically what you find is if the officer retained those, then it's with the correspondence with that officer, so they weren't kept separately. In some cases, because this, like we mentioned, this predates the National Archives, in some cases the officer himself destroyed those letters or took them home with them and kept possession of those letters. So you won't find them in the normal, reports or correspondence. But that's a great question. And then he'll handle the modern.
So in November of 2009, the President issued a directive, an executive order, establishing the National Declassification Center within the National Archives, with a mandate to review about 400 million pages of classified content going back to World War I, with a deadline of December 31st, 2013 to have finished this review. Only two criteria by which it could remain classified: weapons of mass destruction, national security. It did not give me the authority to declassify. It gave me the authority to convene those agencies that had equities in those records to review for declassification. We've reviewed, at this point, we've reviewed about 350 million pages of the 400 million, just to identify who has the equities and how complicated it would be. Of the records that, the documents that we have gone through full processing, about 85% of them have been released to the open shelves, and we're scanning at the same time so that there are digital copies of these available. So we are making progress. I'm really pleased to say that the 6 oldest documents have finally been released. These go back to World War I, and they are 6 documents involving formulas for invisible ink. They have been FOIA'd to death. People have been trying to get at these for years. Leon Panetta, before he left the CIA, these were classified by the CIA, before he left the CIA, had a press conference bragging about releasing these 6 oldest documents. Did not mention the fact that they were released because my staff, the National Declassification Center, discovered that in 1930 1931, they had actually been published. And the way they found these documents, Google Books. And for someone who worked for 5 years at New York Public Library with Google on scanning books, I was so pleased that we've got a really wonderful National Archives use of Google Books.
Thank you very much.
I'll start by apologizing. I used to work for the State Department, so I created a bunch of those classified documents. I'm sorry about that. One of my jobs was as the U.S. Consul General in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is another place where the War of 1812 is not forgotten. Halifax was a big center for prisoners of war. And there was a big sort of quasi-diplomatic effort to arrange the parole and the release and exchange of prisoners of war. So I wondered what the archives tell us about that process. And then kind of the related and maybe broader question about what U.S. diplomacy was like during that time. In other words, how did everybody get to Ghent at the same time? What sort of correspondence is there in the records between us and the British about wanting to negotiate a solution?
We've got besides the Navy deck logs, our State Department records historic records are very heavily used. And it touches on every topic that you just rattled off, where you can come in and you can see the correspondence dealing with the prisoner negotiations. You can see them at different times kind of feeling each other out, like, would you be interested now to kind of work this out or later? So all of that is in the State Department records, where you can, as the years go on, you can get into naval attaché reports and some of the ONI reports that came out of those with some of the secret stuff going on in foreign countries. And so you get a lot of great records that are in the State Department records. And just going through them are fascinating, because a lot of them have really these turning points where there's these opportunities that you can see that it could have gone one way or another. And, in hindsight, we know which way it went. But you see these guys kind of trying to work through these different issues. And some of it can come down to someone is offended by a phrase that was used in a correspondence, and they cut off all communication, and then that leads to all kinds, it's fascinating to go through that stuff. It really is. So we have people that just spend days and months going through State Department stuff and get excited in the research room and say, hey, I found this really great thing. And imagine what would have happened if they agreed on this. So State Department records they have some really great stuff in them.
I had an opportunity at just about the same time the WikiLeaks thing broke. I was getting my orientation to the various record groups and spent some time with State Department records. And my favorite section were diplomatic cables, black-bound volumes, Moscow, pre-World War I. I was flipping through them, reading these. And they have big red stickers on the spines that say "Burn in Emergency." But the tone, reading the snarkiness in the WikiLeaks materials, that same level of snarkiness existed in those pre-World War I Moscow cables from the State Department. Can I just ask Lynn one question?
Yes.
Where is the charter for Georgetown?
I do not have it. Do you happen to know where it is?
We discovered this evening that the National Archives actually has the original charter. So we're going to do some investigation and find out why we have it. And get you a great facsimile of it.
There is, however, something that we do have at Georgetown, and I'm going to ask Lynn Conway to talk a little bit about something that many of us know was a product or a byproduct of the War of 1812. Lynn.
Okay, well, as no one asked me a question, I do just want to make one comment. The documents that I referred to and that I tried to show you tonight come from the University Archives, but the University Archives are part of special collections. And we do have other material in special collections that relates to the War of 1812. That would be discoverable through our website or by contacting special collections. But one of the really wonderful things that we do have. We have a copy of the Star-Spangled Banner written in Francis Scott Key's own hand.
And we're not giving that to the National Archives. I want to thank very warmly David Ferriero and Trevor Plant from the National Archives and Records Administration and Lynn Conway from University Archives.